Hey everyone, welcome to another session of the Strategy Supper Club. In today's video, we are talking about a topic that drives brand strategists nuts. The topic is, what is the difference between an insight and an observation? And to get into this topic, we just did really simple stuff because sometimes these complex topics just need some dead simplicity. So we did some simple definitions of each. We go through two simple exercises that have always helped clarify it for me and the people that I work with. And then we had some great discussions about it, how you use them, how you apply it, when it works, when it doesn't. I hope this is really helpful to you. As ever, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on Twitter. You can email me. And most of all, it'd be really cool to see you in a live session soon. All right. I don't know why, but this topic causes so much agita in the strategy world. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people work themselves up into a lather over does someone know the difference between an insight and an observation? And it's not that this isn't important. This is an incredibly important thing for strategists to have on lock. But also just a warning, especially for people that are getting into the industry, for whatever reason, this topic just sets brand strategists on fire. So what we're going to go through today is how I see the difference between insights and observations, and some exercises that I do with my team so that people can start to clarify what the difference is. At the end of the day, both are valuable. And I do think that sometimes there is this attitude that if it's an observation, it's not helpful and it's not a good thing to have. I actually think observations can be quite valuable in certain contexts and in certain ways of using them. And insights are always valuable, right? So if anyone ever tells you that oh, whatever, screw observations, they're not important, I would actually argue that observations are very important. And we'll get into that in a second. So, and the last thing, oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. All of this is not that mysterious. This is also something that I find that younger strategists and students get a lot of agitation around, that they feel like it's this secret code that can't be cracked. And it's only with a lot of pain and suffering that you're going to understand the difference between the two. I don't think it's that mysterious. And hopefully this can be a bit clarifying to people today. Okay, so let's first talk about observations. So an observation is really the base. Everything starts with an observation. You cannot get to insights without first observing something. So this is one of the reasons why I think that observations are very important, because they are the ladder to the insight. And when we talk about observations, an observation is kind of it's obvious. It's what we tangibly see on the surface. It's what's right there in front of us. I am wearing glasses. I have a shaved head. I'm wearing a black tank top today. That. These are all observations. It's what you can see right there in front of you. Now, here we go. Here's a couple of examples of observations. They're using TikTok. She has red hair. He's wearing Yves Saint Laurent. These are all just the observations of what you can see on the surface of an individual or in an environment. Now, observations are super important, especially when you get to, I would say, cultural and subcultural execution. There are times when your creatives will start working on something and they might put blue hair on somebody. They might cast somebody with blue hair instead of red. And if you know that it's actually more important that there's red hair because red hair is more in line with that culture, that's something that you as a strategist need to call out. Sometimes we just need to call out to clients people just aren't on that platform anymore. We have to move over to this other platform. That's just an observation, looking at the data, looking at the usage patterns. So observations can be quite important, especially when you're getting into the nitty-gritty of execution and making the decisions of what should be shown and what should be in, what should be out, where you should be. But an observation on its own doesn't point you where to go creatively. It only identifies what exists now. We are going to dive into this in one of the exercises in a second and why this is so limiting. But just know that when you give someone an observation, and this is why people get so pissed off about observations, is that an observation, if it's meant to be fueling creative ideation, can often cause a brick wall for creators and innovators. So the danger is if you only say she has red hair, then you only know to give the next person red hair. And so what starts to happen is you start to see copycat products, brands, and experiences. This leads to something that, like, the thing that drives me crazy, and past supper club participants will know, is like how every brand on Instagram looks the same. It's because all the designers and all the founders are observing is like, this is the way you behave on Instagram. They're not thinking why. They're just thinking of, it's that kind of typeface, it's that kind of color palette. And so all of a sudden, every single brand on Instagram starts looking the same. This is the danger with observations, when we just look at them at surface value and we don't understand the underlying why. Another danger with just observations is that you're showing you're not really investing in your audience. It feels a little bit lazy. So again, back to the Instagram example, this is where I start dismissing brands that kind of have that Instagram look, because I don't feel like they're really paying attention to me, and they're not really thinking about how they can engage in an interesting way. They're just taking the easy route and copying somebody else. The other thing that I think is dangerous about just relying on observations is when you're just in that copycat mode, you're not really developing your own point of view about things. You're just kind of saying like, oh, this is the norms, this is the patterns of way things are. I'm going to lock into that norm path, and I'm not really going to think about my own brand, our own position in the world, and what we want to do. So this is also the danger of observations. They build those walls where creation and fresh thought is very difficult. So let's move on to insights, which so many strategy directors, CSOs, whatever, holy grail, right? What is the insight? What is the insight? We hear this all the time. So insights are the motivations that drive the action, which then you can observe, right? So it's what's behind the observation. It's why she has red hair. It's why he's wearing Yves Saint Laurent. It's the whys below. And when you understand the whys, then all of a sudden creation really opens up. So for example, in this, they're using TikTok. Why? Because they enjoy exploring their creativity. She has red hair because it makes her feel bold and powerful. He's wearing that brand because he wants the world to know he's special. When you give creators and innovators these types of statements, there's suddenly a lot more avenues where they can create. We're going to demonstrate this in a little bit. So let's get into the exercises around this. First of all, we're going to go old school. Old school. This is exercise number 1, the 5 whys. This is a classic Procter & Gamble exercise. And yes, Procter & Gamble is a big ass corporation that's been doing this for a long time, but there's a reason that Procter & Gamble is a big ass corporation that's been around for a long time, because Procter & Gamble does insights pretty damn well. They're really good at it. And this exercise comes from Procter & Gamble. And if you've dealt with any client that's gone through their system or respect their system, you're going to run into the 5 whys. And it's actually a really good exercise. And what it essentially is like when you start with an observation, to get to the core insight, the emotional juice, the thing where people can create, ask yourself why 5 times. So let's go through it with our red-haired diva. All right, she has red hair. Why? Because red hair is bold. Well, why is being bold important to her? Because bold makes her feel powerful. Well, why? Why does she want to feel powerful? Well, when she feels powerful, she feels safe. And why is it important to her that she feels safe? That's our 4th why. Well, when she feels safe, she feels that she can truly express. And why does she want to fully and truly express? Well, because it makes her feel alive. Okay, so I'm going to hold on the screen for a little bit so people can absorb this a little bit more. And of course, I totally made this up, of course. But in going through the chains of why, it allows you to have more fertile territory to create. So we're going to skip over this next slide, and I'm going to just jump to the next exercise to show you why this is important. So 1 second. The exercise number 2, whenever I'm trying to demonstrate to strategists why it's so important that you give more fertility, I have them do this exercise. What can I do with that? Okay, if you know that they're using TikTok, and that's what you come back to your client with, our target audience is on TikTok. Great. What can I do with that? Well, we can recommend that the client shows up on TikTok. But really, if we're being really strict in the rules of logic and the rules of insight fueling, that is all I can do with that. I cannot say, well, then we don't show up on Facebook, or we're allowed to show up in these other spaces, because all they've given them is an observation. If we go to the red hair example, she has red hair. Okay, if that's all we know about this woman, when we are thinking about what kind of hair dye to make for her, or what kind of, say, clothing or accessories we want to make for her, the only thing we can know is red. That's all we know. We don't know why she chose red. We don't know how red makes her feel. And because we don't know those additional things, we can't really create. The observational brick wall has gone up, and it really blocks creatives. It does not give them any fuel. It only gives them what you have seen, and therefore they are only repeating the past. However, if you ask a few whys in your insight work, in your thinking work, in your analysis work, all of a sudden it gets much more fertile. But if you know that, like, for example, with this example, if it's ultimately about creativity for this audience, I as a creator can do a lot more with that. Because then if I know that this audience is motivated by creativity and expressing creativity, then we can think about a whole lot of other ways that the brand can connect with this audience over creativity. It might mean that we create, in a post-COVID world, spaces where people can create in person together. We might do, I mean, it's an old idea. We might do like a sleepover in a museum, in an art museum, because creativity is what's really important to them. We might allow them to create this product and co-create it with us. Because if we know that if we know that creativity is important to them, then maybe co-creation is important to them. And then you get a product like Nike ID, there was no example about this, there was no previous program to Nike ID, that was like, oh, let's have people co-create shoes with us. But Nike knew that people cared about creativity and expression. So they took what they had in their wheelhouse, which was shoes. We make shoes. If we know that we have a group that's passionate about creativity, how could we combine that to create a new product or service that's really freaking cool? And this is the difference between an insight and an observation. When you have an insight, it allows people to do more with it. When you have an observation, if we're being really strict about the rules of logic, you can only stop at the observation. And you really want those insight spaces to bloom. To sum it up, and I'm not going to go that more deeply into it, because I think when we start to overcomplicate this topic, this is where people start to get confused. They're like, oh my God, I don't know the difference, blah, blah, blah. It's really not that hard. Both are valuable. Observations are what you tangibly see on the surface. If you only give a creator what is tangibly on the surface, they can only copy that surface observation. But if you give a creator what motivates what came out in the surface, then all of a sudden you can start to ideate and play in other ways that your brand can interact with that motivation. And the fastest way to get to unearthing those motivations is just ask yourself why. And ask yourself why until it gets juicy and juicy and juicy. Now, one thing I want to go back to, just came to mind, I should have built this slide earlier, but we're just going to go back in the deck a little bit, is here on this example where we asked why 5 times. In a why pyramid like this, or why ladder like this, you could play up and down this ladder. You could think about ideation around the concept of power. You can think about concepts around the idea of being safe. You can think about ideation around expression. You can think about ideation around what makes people feel alive. There's lots of ways, like once you start asking the whys, there's more fertile territories that you can play in. And as you become more experienced as a brand strategist, and as you also intersect the result of your whys with what is true to a client, you'll start to hone in on, you know what, for this brand, knowing that she has red hair, knowing that expression is important to her, this brand can really credibly intersect with expression. Whereas if you're working with another brand, that brand may really credibly intersect with the territory of power. Right? So there's decisions to be made in the whys, right? It's not just because the insight exists that you use it, but also it's that you have to intersect it with the brand and realize that your why exercise can actually create a lot of fertile territories. And sometimes we have to narrow those down for our creators so they don't go all over the place. Because if you went to a creator after this ladder and was like, okay, she wants to feel powerful, she wants to feel safe, she wants to feel that she can fully express, she wants to feel alive, it's too broad. It's too broad. So in a case like this, our job as a strategist is to understand what is the most appropriate motivational, emotional territory that most appropriately intersects with the client and create that parameter for your creators to create against. Okay, so we're just going to go through the sum up really one again. Observations, tangibly on the surface, insights, the motivation underneath. Let's discuss.
The one thing that I would say, more so probably for the last 5 years, that also becomes completely violated and misused is the word truth. So I am curious to know your 83 cents on, like, where does truth sit in the spectrum of observation versus insight? Mm-hmm. And then to your point of like helping to coach somebody, especially clients, like, because when they're writing their shitty briefs and it's just a lot of facts, and it's barely, and then there's the word of fact, sorry. So there are like semantics around this that are a lot of trigger words for a lot of different planners.
Yep.
But that word, the word of truth, is like, it gets so abused and violated. It's kind of bananas, but I would love to hear your take on this. I will stop talking. Go.
Okay. Truth. This is a great thing that you brought up, Adrienne. So I think the way that we get to do those ladders well is by us getting closer and closer to our audiences, right? So anyone could have taken that picture of that woman with the red hair, done a Y exercise, and landed in a totally different place than I did, because I was totally making it up. Right? And there would have been nothing wrong with someone else's ladder as long as they were getting more and more motivational and emotional on their way through the ladder. This is why qualitative research is so freaking important, because qualitative research allows us to develop our spidey sense around these audiences, or sometimes just ask them straight up, why do you have red hair? Right? And talk to them and figure out the real truths around it. And one more little rant on this. This is why I am highly suspicious of qualitative research that is conducted solely through social scrapes. Because I don't think people are honest in social. I think people are putting a fake idea of who they are, or a polished idea. We all do it. I do it. Look at my Instagram. It's there, right? I'm not condemning any of us. We all do it. But be really careful, especially in COVID, because it's going to be really tempting to say, you know what, I understand we can't do in-person qual. Let me do a social scrape, and then we're going to figure it out, and we're going to know the truth about this audience. Well, I think your raw data there is flawed. So go watch the video about conducting kick-ass qual. Because if you conduct kick-ass qual, which also has a lot of remote techniques in that video, you can get to these spidey senses around truth, or even just the straight up answers around the truth. Is that helpful, Adrienne?
Yes, it's helpful. But then to help a client or a junior planner or what have you reporting to you, like, how do you help them understand that nuance difference? Because, right, like, it would be easy to say it's the why, like, why, like, in the same way you just introduced us to that exercise. So, like, how do you help them see that the truth is truly rooted in the audience? But, like, then you get the need for tension. Like, so where does that come in?
Okay, so let's talk about like how you take clients along on this journey.
Yeah.
I think like this has been a real focus of my working style for the last 10 years, because the first 10 years it was stupid the way I did it. First 10 years of my working style, it was like, I'm an agency person, I'm coming with a shiny presentation and you're going to think it's amazing, right? And it's like, oh God, like how many times have I just had things blown up on me, and like 4 weeks of work just like went sideways, right? Last 10 years of my career has been way more co-creative, collaborative, right? So if I'm doing research, I'm trying to get research outputs that my clients can engage with, so then they can like go along the journey of the why with me, right? Mm-hmm. So I think my biggest weapon in my arsenal is co-creation with the clients on this stuff. And come in, like, I'll do things like, I'll say like, look, I'm just going to put some stimulus down. Like, here's some early ideas, but let's do a co-creation session where we really talk about this stuff, really talk about what we heard in the research, and really analyze this together. That's how I bring clients along.
And if you are teaching it, because I get asked occasionally to do the boot camps. So usually like before I will tell them to come in with like one or two of each, and then we'll kind of workshop them. So everybody can kind of see the different ways to approach it in the narratives. Like, is there anything you've been doing to help client, like besides the co-create, but like in just helping kind of helping them unlearn what they've learned?
About like insight versus observation, or
yeah.
So it actually, I made it up at W&W one day, and an all hands was exercise 2. The strategists at W&W really asked me this question: what's the difference between an observation and insight? And I didn't have a snappy answer to it. So what I did is I had this woman that worked for me. Her name is Megan. She stood up. I still remember this. She was wearing, and she had on a vest that had fringe on it. And I said, okay, guys, your client is a fashion designer. And it really helps if you do it with fashion, because it's fashion. So like you can say visual. And they say, all right, tell me what Megan's wearing. And they're like, oh, well, she's wearing a fringe vest. And they are like, cool. So what happens if you just give that to your fashion designer client? What can they make? And they're like, a fringe vest. I'm like, exactly. Because you gave them the wall, right? Yeah. Now I want you guys to start talking to Megan about her vest and start asking her some questions.
Okay.
And I literally just had them go through it. And literally, Adrienne, I'm telling you, it took 10 minutes for them to understand the difference. They're like, okay, got it. I understand it now.
Yeah, no, and it's not punitive, and everybody, it's easy. Okay.
It's easy.
I will stop hijacking this. Thank you.
No, it's fine. I love your hijacking.
Heidi, what are the kind of like superpowers to uncovering an insight? Like, you know, asking why so many times, like that sounds like curiosity, like being able to understand people's motivations. Like that sounds like empathy. Like what are the other kind of like superpowers you want to tune into when you're uncovering an insight?
I think that's a really good question. I do like empathy and curiosity. And then I would just add one, I'm not sure what the superpower name would be, but it's almost empathy for the creative. Like you know what, let me go back for a second. Tension hunting is great in this. So with the red hair one, when we're like, actually the red hair had to do with safety, which isn't what you would expect. You're like, wait a second, that's a little bit of a head fuck. That's interesting, right? And that's where like really cool creation can come from. So I would say be a tension hunter. And then the last superpower would be like something about being really empathetic to what your creatives are going through, and like really starting to understand, can anyone do anything with this?
I think also one could be objectivity and detachment, because we are so stuck with our own ways, and sometimes if I'm judging a middle-aged man, I really don't know how to be a middle-aged man. So I really have to step outside of my comfort zone, be objective. So I think that objectivity is a necessary kind of superpower, at least in my.
I think you're right on that. Absolutely. And just like, I think the hardest assignments we have is where we're actually sometimes, or when we're closer to the target market than we're not. Like it's like when we worked a lot with Nike, we did a ton of work in the male athletic space, and we didn't do a lot of Nike women work. In some ways, I think the Nike women work would have been more difficult for me because I am a female athlete and I'm almost too close to it. And it's hard for me to be objective about those spaces. But when I come in and I'm working on a target market, like I know nothing about, it actually is more interesting because I can look at it with a different lens than somebody that might be immersed in deeply. So long way of saying, don't be afraid if you get an assignment where you're like, oh man, I don't know these people, like, because you can actually bring a ton of value to those assignments.
So I remember a TV spot from 10 years ago, the Old Spice, the men your men could smell like. Yeah. I remember the team gave a presentation on their insight, and the insight was that it was the majority who shops for deodorant are not men, are actually women. Yep. It's their girlfriends, their wives. And that's why they created a spot that features a really hot guy talking directly to women with all sorts of whimsical, fantastical circumstances. And it sounds to me like the insight definitely goes beyond surface observations, but it doesn't really dive into the kind of emotional drives. Why are women shopping for their men? Why are men not shopping for themselves?
Yeah.
Would you agree that should this insight have gone further, or that's that can be considered an insight? Because it sounds to me more like shopping behavior.
Right. So funnily enough, I was working on Axe at the same time that Old Spice work was going on. So you just opened up a can of worms because I can talk about this forever. So it is true. Men, especially teenagers, do not buy their own grooming products. But so in previous era, I would say it was this is before Me Too even. Like I would say like before it was the boy would harass his mom and be like, I want Axe, I want Axe, I want Axe. And the mom would be like, cool, whatever. Like whatever will make you shut up and actually groom, because boys stink and they don't like grooming. So moms would buy it for their sons because they're like, I need you to stop smelling. So if this is going to make you take a shower, great. I will buy you whatever the fuck you want because I need you to take a shower because they don't shower. That's true too. They don't shower. So then we go forward a little bit in time and all of a sudden women are starting to pay attention to Axe and seeing like Axe is kind of like a shitty brand towards women, right? And so the moms started resisting buying the Axe for their sons because they didn't want to like be cool with that behavior, you know? And that's when Old Spice came in with this. And so I do think it's important to understand that dynamic. In the earlier age, it didn't matter. You didn't have to think about the woman that much because she was only responding to the request. But then all of a sudden, the purchasing became a moral decision on top of just a making my son happy. And so then you needed to understand who was actually making the purchase, where the Old Spice stuff started to make sense, or it did make sense in that era. I thought they did a great job there. So is that is that answering the question?
Right. No, I was more wondering the difference between an insight and just like does this so-called insight of it's the majority women who does the shopping, or should they have? Right. That's what I was wondering. If I get to that point, should I have gone further, like really delved into the psychology of why it's women who does the shopping? Yeah.
The observation of the women doing the shopping is an observation. It's like right there in the data. You can see it. It's in the shopper marketing data. So then you have to start thinking about what is that relationship that women have to the purchase. So is it, he's bothering you, I don't care what it is, let's just make him shower, I'm not going to think about it. Or is it, what I buy for my son is a value choice and how I want my son to be and how I want the men around me to be, which is what it evolved to, which is why Old Spice won in that era, because Old Spice understood that like they weren't just talking to men, they were talking to women too. And it took Axe a long time to understand that, despite our best efforts to get them to understand it.
Where do you draw the line between a substantiated insight and an unsubstantiated insight, just given the point of having the observations is so you have something to back into and say like, look, this is where this came from. At the same time, if you have something that's like way too basic, you're not going to be able to give your creatives anything to work with. So I guess in terms of having something that's a substantiated or unsubstantiated insight, where do you draw the line between an insight and I guess just an educated guess on the audience?
That's a good question. That's actually a really great question, because the red hair example, that could have gone 50 different directions, right? I just kind of made that up in 5 minutes about what that journey of why was. And that is the danger of being a strategist, is that we impose our own biases on a journey of why, which can get pretty ugly if you think about it. So a couple of things help with this. One is, especially if you're doing qualitative, to do rolling qualitative. So something that I really like to do when I'm doing interviews is that I always leave time after each interview to, like if I'm doing 5 in one day, I make sure the schedule has it that I have a half hour in between each one where I can stop and like write down what I thought the core observations or insights were from that interview. And then what I can start to do is start to play with my discussion guide as the week goes on and start to pressure test some of my hypotheses in interviewing more people that fit the target audience. So I need to do another strategy separate club on discussion guides. Discussion guides at their best are exploration tools that I think morph as the qualitative goes on. Like you need to know what absolutely needs to be captured and then where your exploration is. And I think when you can have an exploratory discussion guide, you can start to pressure test your hypotheses. I think as you just get more experience being in field, you just start to feel it out more, and you can tell when someone's lying. You can tell when something's true or not. You can tell when something's interesting. You can hone in on it a lot faster. And that just takes experience. I think like my first 3 or 4 years in field, I was like just clenching that discussion guide and like just trying to like get exactly what was in it. But as I got more experience and I understood the intuition of doing qualitative and finding insights, you start to figure it out a little bit more. And I think another way, just one more thing to help with this whole process is, you know, when you get assigned to something, starting to immerse yourself in that audience before you ever hit field. So reading the stuff that they read is actually something I think is really important, is like reading their world. Like I almost build sometimes like a separate Instagram account for myself where I just follow different accounts so I can just like pretend I'm them when I'm looking at stuff. And just like really trying to understand them holistically, not just through what they say. Now, a big word of caution on this that we talked about when we did this session last week, you got to be really careful about falling into the trap of social media being the way that you do qualitative, because ultimately, how many people here are 100% honest about their life on their Instagram account or on their TikTok or on whatever they're on? None of us are, myself included. So you cannot base insight work on half truth. And social media is half truth. It really is. It's for all of us. It's half truth. You can use social media as an input and use it as a cautionary input. Like, I understand this is a slight input or like an input that I need to be a little bit cautious of. And of course I use social media when I'm trying to figure out audiences, but just be careful of using that as the basis of observation or insight, because you're going to just go down a flawed journey right away. So yeah, those are just some ideas that I've developed on this type of thing. And there you do, and one more thing, and I'm sorry, this is a long answer. You do start to get a spidey sense for when you overstep on why. I don't know how to explain it. Like you do just kind of get a sense like, I'm taking that one a little bit too far. I can't really say that. I didn't really feel that in the interviews. I didn't really get that in from people. So there is kind of like a spidey sense that starts to come into play when you're pushing the why too far.
What's been your experiences sort of grappling with this sort of debate between trying to find a very clear tension and resolution, and then sort of like the more traditional approach, just like you're saying, Heidi, like finding that really juicy, like fully polished, gut punching insight?
Let's open up to the room. Does anyone have a thought on that?
Yeah, this is Jeff. I'll take a stab at it.
Sure.
It really goes back to, are you solving the business's problem? And, you can come up with these amazing punchy insights or something that's, saved the world. Oh my God, this is huge. But you try and dial that back down to, is this actually solving the problem? No, it's not. Go back to the famous, the loudest noise in a Rolls Royce at 60 miles an hour is the electric clock. That's not a world-saving insight, but it's a well-known ad that was like, that's an insight that somebody picked out of the manual for Rolls Royce and put in the ad that everybody went, oh, that's beautiful, kind of thing. So it's, sometimes I've come up with insights that are like, oh my God, this is just like, would be mind-changing for the entire company, for the audience, for everybody else. That when I started applying it to, all right, this is going to be up against competitive set. This is up against the business reality of what they can afford, what they can market, how loud can they be about this? It will never happen. So I need to either dial it down or change direction of, is there something more impactful that I can come up with that can actually do something in the short term with the marketing, rather than going, it's a brand thing that's going to be over the next 10 years. That's an arc we can start implementing, but that's not the main insight to solve the problem I've got right now.
Yeah, I think there's how insights, like how a good meaty insight works on the business level, but then there's also how it works on the human level. And I think I don't know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately as I try to come up with insights for a campaign I'm working on now. And it's really about, I think, it's kind of like how really good art works, right? It's about how we distill the universal into a very particular experience. And I think like the gut punching amazing insight makes your target take this insight that's really about like them as a group or a whole or a tribe, and makes them look at your creative and think that it's made for them and that it's speaking directly towards them, which is also the same thing that really good art does as well, right? So on a kind of like, I guess like philosophical level, like that's also something.
Oh, I think that's great. That's yeah, it has to work both ways, right? I don't think it is a great insight if it doesn't work for the business and it works for people.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, right? So that's about the investigation. So like figuring out the quadrant in which, or the world in which you're investigating, right? So like if we understand the business is toggling here and it's trying to win here and it's trying to work with this audience, where does that intersect? That's where your insight should be, is in that intersection space.
So let's say that you've uncovered this insight and you can see that it's gotten the wheels turning in your creative's head. But you also recognize that it might be something your brand can't deliver on quite yet. How have you found success in navigating that?
You just got to be really honest. Like a briefing. So when we brief, or when we're thinking about like constructing a brand, there's 4 quadrants that we need to think about, and client is one of those, and then culture, competition, and your audience. And so when you're briefing in a creative, when you're talking about the client C, being really honest with them of like, look, like this is what this can be in the world today, and this is what it can't be. And so this is where we have to be really careful as strategists. Like, it's fun to walk in with like a juicy insight and your creatives think you're the best strategist in the world. You're like the best creative partner. But it's shitty when they hit up against a brand that can't deliver it, or a competitive set where that insight doesn't mean shit. So our insight work always has to be very cognizant of the other areas of brand when we build it, to make sure that we don't take our creatives down bad paths.
Sure, and I guess I should say this is usually when like the team's working super quick and it's like, write a brief in a day, and you're like, ah.
Yeah.
So you do these 5 whys and you're trying your best to get an insight, and like using your example, you get to the like, okay, powerful is like the best intersection with this audience, with what this client has to offer. Like if we want to like nail it, it should be powerful.
Right.
And then you like make your brief, and you try to like get the creatives all excited about powerful, and they're like, I don't like powerful. Like, can you give me another insight? I just don't like that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
totally.
It's really frustrating. I'm not necessarily saying like, what should we do? But like that happens a lot.
It happens a lot.
More than I want it to.
It happens a lot. And actually, I'm going to do a strategy supper club session on this in a little bit, but let me give you a preview really quickly. Okay. So when I was working at BBH, I worked with these 2 brothers. They were from Sweden. They were the Chanel brothers, Kalle and Pelle Chanel. And they were my booze, and they had a very Swedish way of working, and they Swedified me. And I learned how to work in that system. And now I just do it on all my creative briefs. And what I don't ever do anymore is write a creative brief. I don't write creative briefs anymore. I say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here are a bunch of things that we know about the client. Here's what we know about our people, the audience. Here's what we know emotionally about them. Functionally, like where they're on TikTok, right? Here's some things that we know about the competition, what's going on. Here are a couple territories that I think are interesting. Let's workshop this shit together. And we're going to figure out how we're going to solve the problem. And so it's really important when you don't write creative briefs anymore and get stubborn like me, is that you get really good at problem articulation. And what you're also doing is you're flooding your creatives with stimulus. I flood them. Sometimes when I do this process, I literally send ahead a 10-page Google Doc with 2 pages on behavioral insights, 2 pages on emotional insights, 2 pages on competitive insights, and I work with them. We have to solve this problem. What do we think is the most interesting thing? I have some hypotheses, right? So to your point, Tina, I got tired, and it wasn't that Kalle and Pelle were insolent, although they could be insolent sometimes, and I say that with love, and they would admit it themselves. But it was more creatives that I worked with that weren't them, that were just bitches, that you would like come in with like a creative brief, and they'd be like, I don't like it. Nah. And it's like, and it was just like, oh, go fuck yourselves, right? And what I realized was like, okay, all right, like let's back down off of my ego. And they're in a point of vulnerability. They want everything to be perfect so they can shine. If you bring them along on the process, they actually are like, you're going to get places that are much better. And the other thing I will say, and I'm sorry, I'm like ranting on this, is I would also bring along our media team, our engagement team. Sometimes clients would be in the room in those meetings. Like we got to a point where this type of meeting became like our signature meeting, like where we would set up this room and I had a way of setting up the room to do it. I had a system of like sending the stimulus ahead of time. I had a way of moderating it. And this became the way that my Swedish brothers and I worked with clients.
Thank you. I think those two exercises are pretty helpful. I'm a few years into my career, and I think it's one thing to kind of like understand this concept on your own, but another thing to try and teach it to people who have no idea like what an insight is. And I'm starting to work with interns and people who are just kind of getting into strategy, and I think there's a lot of like moving parts, and one way that people teach insights is kind of like triangulating between a few different observations and finding where they intersect. But I think that's kind of hard sometimes for them to grasp. So I'm wondering if you or anyone else has had any like success, something that's just really simple to help new people just kind of click and get what this is all about.
Not to toot my own horn, but go to the 4 C's deck and the 4 C's video on Strategy Supper Club. It talks about how you take a 4 C's investigation and then how to really quickly orient everything you've learned to make a really compelling story that has tension and hopefully insight. And essentially what it is the premise of all the work that I do is that a brand is a story. At the end of the day, all it is a story. And if we want to build great stories, we should look at the patterns of great stories. Like there's a pattern to like great storytelling in culture that has gone back for thousands and thousands of years. And what that deck does and that video explains is how to exploit the classic fairy tale storytelling construct so that it's really easy to create a brand story with great tension and great insights. So I would take a look at that if you have a chance.
Anna, as a creative leader, I ask our teams to not just expect the brief to solve the problem, obviously. I think that's laziness on our behalf, which is just expecting it to be served up to us. And but I'd love to give our teams more tools, more strategist-like tools to do their own research, and they don't have access to qual tools, or they're not scrubbing social. But I love your point about not relying solely on social, listening to get an insight. But is there like a recommendation so that it's not purely conjecture for them as they go through an exercise like that to get to like tangible, I guess, to make those insights truthful? To Adrian's point, like how do you know that there's truth in those things, not just one person's interpretation? Or I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, whenever I start on a new project, one of the first things I do is I set up a bunch of Google alerts for topics around it. And a lot of this stuff is like, there's so rarely like the perfect article that's written about it or the perfect blog post, but just by continually immersing in a lot of different pieces of stimulus, the picture starts to emerge. And I think that's my point around social media. It's not that I don't use social media when I work on a project, I do, but I use it in balance with a lot of other things as well. And another thing that I really try to do is I try to identify somebody in my life who probably really fits the target profile. And I'll call them up and I'll talk to them about it. In fact, my nieces and nephews, I have 8 nieces and nephews, which is great because like a range of target audiences, right? And they just kind of joke like, oh, Tante Heidi needs some help with a project again, because like on most projects, one of them will fit the target profile. And so I just try, so this is something your creatives can do. Like think of somebody in your life that is probably the target market. Set up some Google alerts, follow, I always give my creatives like 10 or 15 Instagram accounts to follow, or 10 or 15 whatever platform accounts to follow, not because they're total truth, but because they're kind of representative of who we're trying to pull together. So it's just little things like that. It's just, I think it's about, and I think the best strategists are in a constant state of absorbing. You're always absorbing stuff.
One way to help everybody kind of keep moving and like treat the brief as a starting point is, and especially in co-creating with clients, it's been helpful when I've been like, do we want to be the lift of our category or whatever it is? Like, so it gives them the guardrails and the things that like, is this audience then it needs to be seamless. It needs to be app driven, whatever those behaviors are. Like I have been using that quite frankly as like a cheat to help work through all the stuff Heidi's talking about with like the behavioral insights, because I've got to make a journey or whatever it is. that analogy piece is super helpful, just because whatever is intuitive about it to each person, you don't really need to worry about the research. Not that I am anti-research, but like in the quick fix of it, it really does help if you can kind of agree on a small benchmark of like, we would like or wish we were or not. Like, we fucking don't want to be Uber because this is all the yucky stuff about Uber. I will stop talking, but that is usually helpful.
So helpful. It's
That's
so
great.
helpful.
Thank you.
So I was just wondering, like, in my world, the coach could say, we're only worried about ourselves and what we do, our practice, our habits, but a lot of that is bullshit because we're always aware of what the other guy is doing. So off your Axe Old Spice example, like, how much time and effort do you put into looking over the wall and seeing like, hey, what are those guys up to versus I got to make sure that my house is in order over here?
That's a really great question. And this goes back to kind of the 4 C's talk that we did before the session, and review that video if you want to hear more about this. But if you think of the 4 C's, you have client, competitive, culture, and consumer, which I hate. So audience, and don't use tribe. We don't use that anymore either. Okay, so we call them audiences or our people. And of those 4, every strategic exercise I work on usually kind of leans into one or the other. So some clients I work on, I really have to pay attention to what's going on in the competition. So when Old Spice was surging, when I was working on Axe, you bet your ass we were like watching everything they were doing. We were like trying to figure out like what was going on. And we were also using it as fodder to say like, hey, world's changing, come on. So, you know, we did that. When I worked on the Google Chrome launch, we didn't give a shit about Bing. We didn't look at Bing. We didn't, Yahoo? Like, we weren't worried about that. Like, and the competitive C like shriveled into like a little ball that we poofed away. Right. So I think on every client you work at, there's just this, through experience, there's just making the call of what C are you really leaning into and what that project requires. And sometimes, yeah, you are looking over the wall constantly. And other times you're just like, fuck it. Like, we're just going to move forward and we're just going to do our thing.
I work at an interesting agency, so we're an influencer marketing agency. So part of our creatives are people, everyday creators. And then part of it is our team kind of plays this like 3 like headed dragon role. They are part insights, they are part creative producer, and they are also like the person that makes sure that the campaign actually facilitates. And so Michael, when you were asking some of your questions, and something Heidi you said was just like getting immersed and giving yourself time to consume is something that I'm trying to actually give my team permission as well as teach how to do. And so interested in the group's perspective, whether it be younger teams or not having a quote unquote built out beautiful process for this strategy work, but seeing a huge gap for it. How do I take folks along that journey or help them create or cultivate time without saying you need to take 4 days off of your current job to be able to transform observation into strategy that can ultimately transform the way that we do our work?
That's awesome.
There's a lot in there, but hopefully you guys can.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm going to pop in really quick, but I would actually really prefer to open this up to the group. The only thing that I would just be really cognizant of, and I think we're fucking this up right now because of speed and of the speed of work, is that creating a strategy and creating strategic thoughts is a creative process. And sometimes we think it's only the creatives that have to go through a creative process. We have to go through the same thing. We have to immerse ourselves into a lot of information. We need time for our brains to go away and wander for a little bit and like turn off. So then we can have the aha shower moment. So I think there is something for people who are leaders in strategy situations to remind the rest of the agency that, and this is so trite, the creative department aren't the only creatives. Like, they have to go through a process as well. So that's all I'll say, but I would love to hear other people on this.
I would just reinforce. Sorry.
Go ahead, Michael.
Please.
I was going to back up. I was going to back you up.
No. Please, Tina, go.
I was just going to say, like, the question that you had is a great one of like, how can the creative jump in and do research as well? And I think sometimes strategists are kind of like, but you're doing my job. And I always give strategists the recommendation of like, do the research that nobody else is doing. Like, find that hole and like dig deep there. And it's usually like stuff about business that no one cares about. But like, if you can do that, then like the whole team can come together with their bits and pieces. And I feel like that's really helpful because we are moving way too fast. So it's like, how can we get the most done with the most people as quickly as possible or whatever. But yeah, find the thing that no one else is looking at.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a great point. No, I would just add that, like, and this is, and Carly can attest, like, we don't adhere to lanes very carefully at Omelet. Like, and that's something I love. I often say, like, our best strategists are creatives and our best creatives are strategists. And we definitely enjoy blurring those lines and leaving the doors unlocked and the table open for everyone to, I mean, there's no, I don't know. My experience has been like, it's on all of us to carry the burden of the art and the science. I know creatives know how to write and art direct and they lean on that, but like, I think we're always trying to push to be better, like, you know, critical thinkers as part of the creative process. And like, I'm not just saying this because I'm in a room full of planners and strategists, but I think some of the best thinking comes from that collaboration and oftentimes from your side of the room. So yeah, I just want to make our teams better at, certainly don't want to do your job, but like meet you halfway or more than halfway so that like, it's not a painful process. It's not an us and them. It's just like, it's magic. It's more magical. So
yeah. And I think something I would say, like in my experience, if you have a lot of different people exploring in a lot of different places, create spaces or organization tools where it can get collected in one place, or else you're going to have someone running off in one direction or another direction. So if like in the beginning, when we get briefed and we'd all be in that exploratory phase, we would always make sure to have like times to chat, like where everyone would come together, like, what did you learn? What have you been seeing? Or like now Slack does it in a really beautiful way, right? But making sure that like people aren't running off too insane, like, or else it can get ugly later on if someone entrenches in one space and someone else entrenches in another.
Dominique Brown, a strategist, I believe she's in New York now. She had a pitch basically to her creatives, and it was on, I want to say Boar's Head, some deli meat. And instead of kind of going through the process like this is nostalgic, you want to have this for your lunchbox, etc., what she did is she asked all the creatives their favorite kind of sandwich. And then she actually brown bags them all with like a little, their name on the front. And it would just kind of brought back that nostalgic kind of vibe of, oh yeah, like you loved it when you're like, well, sometimes when your mom put in a little note and it was like really cute and you had that nostalgia and you got excited about that. So that's kind of another way. It doesn't have to just be on paper. It could be multi-sensory, kind of just really get the point across. So
yeah, experiential briefings are the best. Yeah. Like if you can, I've seen planners do some amazing ones. I've tried to do my own. Anytime that you can take someone off site, anytime that you can put something in their hands, make them taste something, it's the best way to brief. And now in this day and age, like, do you just like send your creatives boxes and like have a box full of stuff to do the briefing? There's a lot of ways to do. But one way that I've done experiential briefing in the past is create the bag of the audience. So like if it's a college student, you give them a backpack and you fill the backpack with all the objects and each object is an insight. I built rooms at Nike. So we used to build rooms at Nike HQ. Like this is a typical 13-year-old and this is what their room is. And then they could go through the room and it was like a museum exhibit, like where the insights about their life was on like different things. And they had like it was cool. So like, yeah, anytime you can go experience, I love talking about experiential briefings. Anytime you can do it, it's great.
So I think one of the things, to go back to Jackie, what you were talking about, and to reiterate what Tina was saying, we're always constantly having to move faster. And as Heidi said, we are always soaking things up. So I think one of the things that I like to remind my junior strategists of is that your gut is something you're paid for.
I love that.
You spend time cultivating that. So, you know, while I'm not saying just go with your first insight, don't, you know, look in and make sure that it's right, just go with it. I think that you have to trust your gut. And one way that I like to do this with my creatives is at the beginning of a project, right after we've gotten briefed by the client, I like to host what I call a hunches and hypotheses session. At Giant Spoon, we called it a curiosity session. And it's when I get everyone in the room, account people, producers, creatives, and we talk about what's your gut say. And that oftentimes makes the whole process not only move so much faster because our guts are so freaking powerful. And it gives you really strong hypotheses to then go dive into research with, but it also helps to get the creatives bought in really early on because they know that their insights, their hunches, their hypotheses truly matter to you. And that's why you're taking this hour with them.
I love it.
Fun. So I've been doing what Katie just said. I call it the kitchen sink vomit, only because clients kind of fire hose you and you got to take it on. That being said, what I will then do after that is then start a working Google Doc so that, like, as I am finding again and keeping the conversation going, like, everybody can see and I'm not hiding anything. So if there's something they're vibing on or hate, I'm also getting pretty quick feedback. So to your point, when you get briefed at 10 and then you have to have a briefing at 3, which is like, fuck my life. Like, that at least helps keep things moving. If by 3 o'clock if to Heidi's point, you can't say no brief, but like, at least you're like, okay, let's look at my Google Doc, because this is kind of, I can Mad Libs this thing together if we feel like these are the things. So that is like, again, I am all about convenience and fast cheats, but that Google Doc thing, especially for creatives, it's living and they can go back, because sometimes they find, I may have found like some weird fact or statistic about something, and that right there is like a thread for a big idea. So I just like to keep all of my shit that I'm thinking about like in an open place. So
that's awesome.
Talking, but that definitely helps.
That's awesome, Adrian. I love that.
So how do you mention you don't write creative briefs with creatives anymore?
Not too much.
So you just work out. So do you work out with them the single thing that typically in the brief there is like a single thing you need to communicate. So do you work that out with them? And after the session, then do you still write a creative brief to summarize the result?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. At some point, you do need to have that like landing document. It's just a difference of when it's brought into the team. So yes, work it through as much as you can beforehand with the creatives. Create the Bible document or whatever your religion is, and then you move forward from there.
And do you often find yourself that you need to kind of not have to control the thought process of the creative a little bit so that they don't stray too much away from? Do you have a preconceived idea in your mind already, and then, or do you try to keep an open mind and work with the creative and come up with the thing together?
I really do try to keep an open mind because I used to be a creative and I realized I'm not good at it. And I've had too many experiences where I've had the idea in the back of my head and then someone comes back with something like, fuck, that is so good. And I never would have gotten there. Right. So for me, my job when the work starts coming back is to just consistently go back to that grounding document and say, does it honor what we decided we were going to do in this path forward? And if not, is the core of the idea fundamentally so off that we can't do it? Or is the core pretty good, but we just have to make some adjustments? And that's where I become a creative collaborator. That's just me, like just because I know what I suck at. And I think it's important for all of us to know what we suck at in the creative process.